I don't want her. I never did.
But why would you?
The late September rain fell like silk against the windows of the Young family estate in Seoul. But inside the corridor outside the library, my skin felt feverish beneath layers of white satin and French lace. 24 years old, and this was supposed to be the beginning of my new life. Instead, I stood frozen in the hallway, my wedding gown weighing on me like armor I never wanted to wear, listening to voices carry through the half-open door. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. Min Seo, my translator and the only person who had shown me any kindness in the 3 months since the contracts were signed, had gone to find my mother. I'd wandered away from the bride's preparation room, suffocating under the weight of tradition and expectation, seeking a moment of silence in this fortress of marble and secrets that would soon become my cage. But when I heard Taesung's voice, low, sharp, precise as a blade, I stopped breathing. 나는 그녀를 원하지 않는다. 처음부터 원한 적이 없다. I don't want her. I never did. So what happens next? Does Vera walk down that aisle knowing she's unwanted? Does she confront him? Or does she find a way to turn this cold, calculated arrangement into something he never saw coming? If you want to find out, and trust me, this story goes places you won't expect, you need to subscribe right now. Because here's the truth. That 52% who watch without subscribing, they might miss the next chapter. The algorithm won't show it to them. But you can make sure you don't miss a single moment of Vera and Taesung's journey from strangers to something far more dangerous. Hit that subscribe button. It's free. Comment below. Tell me, do you think Taesung really doesn't want her? Or is he lying to himself? Just one sentence. Let's find out. The Korean words sliced through me even though I barely understood them. But I didn't need perfect comprehension. His tone told me everything. Min Seo had appeared beside me at some point, her face pale, her hand gripping my wrist as if to pull me away. She didn't. She just stood there, translating in a whisper that trembled. She's a means to an end. Nothing more. I pressed my palm against the cool wall, the intricate beating of my bodice suddenly suffocating. My veil, hand-embroidered by artisans my mother had flown in from Paris, cascaded down my back like a white shadow, a mockery of the life I'd imagined for myself before I became a bargaining chip. Another voice responded, older, deferential, one of his lieutenants. Then why proceed with the ceremony? Sojangnim? There was a pause. In that silence, I felt my future calcify. Because her mother controls the American distribution channels. Taesung replied, his voice empty of everything except calculation. This marriage gives us access to markets we've been locked out of for a decade. The Hansen name opens doors. The girl herself is irrelevant. The girl. Not Vera. Not even she. Just the girl. Min Seo's grip tightened. My vision blurred at the edges, not from tears. I wouldn't give this moment tears, but from the sudden understanding of exactly what I was. Precious cargo, a key, a chess piece in a game I'd never agreed to play, delivered to a man who had already decided I was nothing. The traditional wedding drums began their hollow rhythm somewhere in the distance. In 2 hours, I would walk down an aisle lined with white orchids and centuries of tradition toward a man whose reputation had reached me long before I ever saw his face. Yoon Tae-sung, the Black Viper of Seoul, the man who had built an empire on fear and precision, who eliminated obstacles without hesitation, who had never, according to every whispered story, shown mercy to anyone who underestimated him. And now I would become his wife, or rather, his footnote. 2 hours felt like 2 seconds. The lace on her sleeves felt heavier than the gown itself, as if fabric could somehow sense humiliation before it arrived. Vera stood at the entrance of the wedding hall, where the scent of flowers was sweet and suffocating at the same time. Laughter rolled in waves from the crowd inside. hundreds of guests buzzing with congratulations for a love that did not exist. Musicians positioned themselves near the altar as though they were preparing to bless a union, while she stood like something placed on display rather than someone being celebrated. She's a means to an end, nothing more. His words still echoed in her skull, the Korean phrase carving itself deeper with each breath. Gunyo는 Sudanil Bunia. She had barely understood the language when she heard it 2 hours ago, but the coldness in his tone needed no translation. Min Seo's whispered interpretation had only confirmed what Vera's heart already knew. Her fingers curled slowly around the bouquet, squeezing until petals bent and stems snapped inside her grip. The flowers were pale and delicate, perfect and useless, like her hopes. She didn't cry. Maybe tears refused to be part of something this humiliating. Instead, her body felt hollow, like someone had opened her chest and scooped everything out, leaving only the echo of that sentence. A means to an end. How strange, she thought, that 3 seconds of overheard truth could erase months of reassurance, smiles, polite dinners, distant phone calls with her mother assuring her this was for the best. All those moments now turned into props, placed there to guide her where they wanted her without letting her see the cliff ahead. The wedding coordinator appeared at her elbow, smiling too brightly, gesturing that it was time. Time to walk. Time to perform. Time to become Mrs. Jung Tae-sung in front of everyone who believed this was a fairy tale. The double doors opened. When she finally walked down the aisle, it felt like watching someone else do it. People turned to look at her with admiration, whispering about how beautiful she looked, how lucky she must feel. Cameras flashed, flowers framed the hall with softness, music swelled. None of it touched her. She kept her head high because dignity was the only thing left that still belonged to her. The path to the altar felt miles long. Tae-sung stood there, groom suit perfect, posture flawless, expression unreadable to everyone else. Yet to her, it was painfully clear now. There was nothing behind it, no warmth, no affection, just obligation dressed as ceremony. Because her mother controls the American distribution channels, this marriage gives us access to markets we've been locked out of for a decade. The Hansen name opens doors. The girl herself is irrelevant. Their eyes met. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize with a look. He didn't even show guilt. If anything, there was a flicker of something like annoyance, as if this moment required more performance than he was willing to give. He took her hand because the priest guided them into it. His touch was steady and cold. The entire hall radiated celebration, yet the space between them felt like winter. Words were spoken, promises read aloud, vows repeated in both English and Korean, languages that were supposed to bind them, but only highlighted the distance. Rings exchanged. People smiled and nodded as if love was thick in the air, while she felt only emptiness pressing against her ribs. Every cheer, every clap, every camera click felt like a lie being hammered deeper into her skin. She wondered if any of these smiling guests would notice the silence behind their smiles if they stood where she stood. Probably not. People rarely see cracks unless they are forced to fall through them. When the priest finally announced them husband and wife, the hall erupted in applause. Her name and his name sounded like they were being tied together not by affection but by expectations written by other people. He leaned forward to kiss her, a kiss that meant everything to the world and nothing to him. She felt it before it even happened. How empty it would be, how carefully staged, how polite and detached. His lips brushed hers like someone checking off a requirement. There was no warmth, no slow tenderness, no tremor of emotion, just completion of a task. She smiled afterward. It wasn't real, but it was flawless. Years of learning how to survive socially demanding situations had their use now. She smiled for the guests, for the families, for the cameras, for the dream that everyone thought she was living. Inside, she folded herself into something smaller so she wouldn't break apart before the night ended. As they walked back down the aisle together, hands joined for the world to admire, she felt like she was being marched into a life she never agreed to live in truth. She wanted to scream. She wanted to rip the veil off and tell everyone what he said. She wanted to shatter the illusion so no one could call this story beautiful again. Yet she also knew how stories like this worked. Power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it sat still, lifted its chin, and refused to bow, no matter how much the heart trembled. So she walked with grace, chin steady, smile soft, because if she couldn't have loved today, she would at least keep her dignity. The music played as if it was celebrating a miracle. The guests cheered as if they were witnessing a fairy tale. Tae-sung played his role with the ease of someone used to pretending, and Vera, in the middle of it all, understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't a wedding. It was an agreement dressed as romance. It was a contract wrapped in lace. It was a show, and she was expected to sparkle through it. But inside that calm, inside that silence, something else woke up in her. Not hope, not anger yet, but a quiet promise to herself. If she was only a means to an end in his world, then she would decide what that end would cost him. The West Wing felt like a place built for the purpose of forgetting people existed. Silent carpets, long polished floors, the faint scent of something expensive and cold lingering in the air. When they led Vera there, no one said much. They guided her like something carefully placed out of sight, somewhere that would not disturb the grand picture Tae-sung's family preferred to show the world. A separate corridor, a different door, a different life from the one that had been promised to her. The room they gave her was beautiful in the way hotel rooms are beautiful, precise, tasteful, and stripped of any soul. Heavy curtains framed a window she wasn't sure she was supposed to open. A bed, too wide for one person, sat at the center. White sheets folded tight as if to warn her not to leave evidence of her presence. The staff unpacked her things without ever quite looking at her. Their movements were quick, efficient, and strangely careful, like they were handling something fragile or dangerous. When they finished, they bowed slightly and slipped out, leaving her with the echo of the latch clicking shut. The wedding night did not arrive with soft music or whispered affection. It came with a knock on the door and the steady, polite footsteps of a man who seemed to be moving through obligation. Tae-sung stood there in the doorway, handsome and distant, already half gone even as he stood in front of her. They sat on the bed like strangers sharing the same train carriage. He spoke to her in measured words, the kind used in a courtroom or a business negotiation rather than a bedroom. He apologized without really apologizing. He explained without truly opening up. Duty, family expectations, agreements already decided by others, words that settled like frost on her skin. When it happened, it was brief, almost ceremonial, something done because it was expected, because it belonged to the structure of the day, the same way the speeches and congratulations had belonged earlier. There was no tenderness in it, no attempt to reach her or understand what this might mean for her. When it ended, he offered a tired, polite smile, the kind people give when they want to soften a blow but do not intend to change anything. He told her to rest. Then he was gone, and the silence that followed was crushing. She could still feel the faint warmth on the sheets, disappearing faster than she wanted to admit. Days began to stretch, long and heavy. The West Wing turned into a quiet prison, the kind where doors are always open, but you never really feel free. Breakfast arrived on a tray that was placed on the small table by the window. Lunch followed later with the same quiet precision, dinner again when the sky turned dark. The food was carefully plated, beautiful, perfect. She could taste nothing. Each delivery was accompanied by the same bowed heads, the same eyes fixed firmly on the floor. No one lingered. No one asked questions. No one risked kindness. The staff moved through the house like ghosts, present yet unreachable. They addressed her with respect, but without warmth, as if her status required courtesy, but her humanity required distance. Sometimes she tried to speak to them anyway. Small attempts, a greeting, a simple question about the weather outside. They would answer, brief and controlled, then retreat quickly as though they might be punished for acknowledging she had feelings. It left her with an odd sense of invisibility, like she occupied a strange space between guest and prisoner, wife and stranger. She walked the corridor often simply to remind herself her legs still worked. The walls were decorated with art that probably had stories, but none were shared with her. Occasionally she heard laughter drifting from somewhere else in the house, another wing, another world. Voices she could never quite understand fully because they spoke in tones of familiarity, belonging, history. The sounds never reached her hallway fully. By the time they arrived, they were already fading. It felt like listening through water. At night, the house settled into an even deeper hush. That was when the loneliness felt loudest. She would lie on the wide bed staring up at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines in the shadows. She imagined what people thought when they heard about her, the new wife, the foreign addition, the necessary piece in a much larger, carefully arranged puzzle. She wondered if anyone outside those walls knew how quiet her life here truly was. She wondered if Tae-sung thought about her at all once he returned to his side of the compound. Sometimes she heard the faint sound of doors closing somewhere far away, and she would find herself listening like a child listening for footsteps that never arrived. She tried to keep herself anchored. She organized the few personal items she had brought. A book on the side table she pretended to read. A scarf that still carried a faint hint of a different place, a different life, before her world narrowed to carpets and quiet hallways. She watched the light move through the room like it had its own story to tell. Morning brightness melting slowly into afternoon softness, then surrendering to night. With time, the weight of being unseen began to press in on her. It wasn't just loneliness, it was the feeling of being erased while still alive. She was here, yet nobody looked fully at her. Nobody asked her anything that mattered. She had become part of the furniture, acknowledged, maintained, never truly touched. A person placed in a corner of a grand house so the main rooms could shine. On some evenings, she stood at the window and looked across the dark courtyard toward the part of the compound where she knew he slept. Lights glowed faintly in those distant windows. People moved beyond curtains she would never be invited to open. She wondered if Tae-sung ever thought of crossing the corridor again, if he ever felt even a flicker of guilt or hesitation. Maybe he convinced himself she was fine. Maybe he believed quiet comfort was kindness. Maybe he had learned to numb himself long ago. She wrapped her arms around herself, not because she was cold, but because she needed the illusion of being held. She whispered thoughts into the silence, just to hear a voice in the room. She reminded herself she was still someone with a past, with emotions, with dreams that had not entirely died, even if they had been pushed aside for now. Life in the West Wing settled into a rhythm that was too calm, too controlled, the kind of calm that felt like being slowly covered in glass. Every day began gently and ended gently, but the gentleness hurt more than cruelty might have. Cruelty at least acknowledges your presence. Silence pretends you do not exist. And so Vera continued, breathing inside someone else's carefully arranged world, separated by a corridor that might as well have been a continent, surviving one quiet day at a time while the house pretended she was only a shadow moving through borrowed light. Vera first noticed the shadow before she noticed the rules. It was subtle at the beginning, something you might shrug off as coincidence if you wanted to feel free. A man lingering at the lobby desk longer than necessary. A woman pretending to scroll her phone while watching the elevator close. The same unfamiliar car idling near the corner cafe 2 mornings in a row. She told herself this city was simply observant. Then she realized observant shouldn't feel like a net. She had expected Taesung to ignore her completely once she was allowed to move around. He had that practiced coldness, like life was a hallway and he only walked straight. Yet freedom here came with invisible walls. Whenever she changed direction, someone adjusted. Whenever she slowed down, someone pretended they were never moving at all. They carried radios, they whispered to their sleeves, they wore ordinary faces over disciplined eyes, a rotating security detail, not for a celebrity, for her. She pretended not to care, because pretending was sometimes the closest thing to control. She ordered pastries she didn't want just to sit longer somewhere. She wandered streets aimlessly to see who followed. No matter what path she took, someone new would always appear at the edge of her vision. She thought of a zoo enclosure made of glass, so clean the animals kept walking into it. Min Seo came into her days like a break in heavy weather. She was young, maybe early 20s, with that bright sort of kindness that suggested she hadn't yet learned how to ration it. She had been assigned as Vera's translator, though she often slipped into the role of companion as easily as breathing. She laughed too easily, apologized for things that weren't her fault, and looked at Vera the way someone looks at a human story rather than a situation. "You get used to it," Min Seo said once while walking beside her, as if addressing birds or traffic rather than bodyguards disguised as citizens. "They're trying not to be obvious. They think they're being respectful. They're not," Vera replied, calm on the outside. Irritated enough on the inside to want to snap the air in half. Min Seo nodded thoughtfully, like that answer deserved a seat at the table. "He thinks this keeps you safe, and when he thinks something matters, he doesn't let it go." There it was again, him, always hovering like a gravity field she couldn't escape even without touching him. Taesung rarely spoke to her now. Their conversations had shrunk to logistics and cool politeness. He behaved as if she were insignificant, and yet constructed an entire security orbit around her existence. It was baffling. It was suffocating. It was strangely personal for someone supposedly detached. One afternoon, they were sitting in a small tea place with warm light and quiet music. For once, the city faded and the moment felt normal. Min Seo stirred sugar absent-mindedly, then spoke the way someone does when they forget to check if the thought has consequences. "He always watches the footage of you at night." Vera didn't respond at first. The spoon in her hand paused mid-air. She blinked once, steady. "What?" Min Seo's eyes widened a split second too late. No, I just meant, say it." Vera's voice wasn't loud, only precise. She leaned slightly forward, not to threaten, but because the truth had stepped into the room and she wanted to meet it directly. Min Seo swallowed, guilt coloring her gentle face. "There are cameras, everywhere you go. You know that." She hesitated, searching for softer words and finding none soft enough. "He reviews your day, every day, personally. He doesn't let anyone else handle it." The room seemed to narrow. The air shifted, like it had been secretly holding its breath and finally let it out. Vera stared past Min Seo, concentrating on the slow tilt of a hanging plant as though it could anchor her. "He watches me?" Vera repeated, quieter now, not quite believing the sentence belonged to her life. "Yes," Min Seo whispered. "Not for bad reasons. He says it's for protection, to make sure nothing went wrong, to see what needs improving. But it's every night. He never misses." A strange combination of emotions pressed in at once. Anger came first with its sharp edges. She was a person, not a project. She could make mistakes. She could breathe without someone studying how. Then another feeling slid beneath the anger, unwelcome and confusing. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't affection. It was the disorienting knowledge of being seen by someone determined not to look at you directly. She imagined him in some quiet room, late, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, laptop glowing on his face, pausing, rewinding, watching her sit on a park bench, watching her press her hands to her face after a hard thought, watching her laugh once, briefly, when Min-seo nearly tripped on nothing, studying her like she was weather and he was determined not to be surprised by storms. "That's not protection," Vera murmured. "That's a cage with CCTV." Min-seo winced, then gently reached across the table and touched Vera's fingers. "He doesn't know how to care normally. He only knows how to control things so they don't break." "I'm not his thing," Vera replied. "I know." Min-seo squeezed lightly, as though confirming Vera still existed in her own hands. Later, walking back, the city looked the same but felt different. Every reflective surface felt like an eye. Every lamppost could hide a lens. She could not unknow what she now knew. Tae-sung had taken her presence and turned it into a daily ritual of surveillance. And perhaps even worse than the invasion was the implication. Indifference had never really been indifference. He had been pretending while paying obsessive attention in private. She laughed once, but the laugh held no humor. Of course he was that kind of contradiction. The man who built walls out of rules and then paced behind them like he couldn't stop himself. The man who refused softness yet memorized the movements of someone he insisted didn't matter. When she reached the apartment, night already painting the windows darker, she stood in the living room and looked straight up at a camera in the corner. For the first time, she didn't pretend it wasn't there. She let herself be fully aware of it, of him on the other end at some later hour. "If you want to know me," she whispered toward the lens, steady and unafraid, "try talking instead of watching." It was reckless and pointless and probably disappeared into silent storage, but it returned something to her. Choice. Voice. A small rebellion inside the invisible cage. Min-seo sat with her that evening, telling stories about growing up, laughing, filling the space with sincere warmth so the room wouldn't feel like a monitored box. Vera listened, grateful for human presence that wasn't assigned to control her. Yet through all the warmth, she felt the quiet pulse of awareness. He would see this later. He would watch her smile. He would see the way she leaned back, exhausted but stubbornly unbroken. The invisible cage had revealed itself, but knowledge changes cages. They don't feel as silent once you name them. And somewhere out there, a man who pretended not to care would watch her again, and maybe feel something he didn't know what to do with. She did not decide to learn Korean out of curiosity. It began with a sting to her pride. Every time someone spoke, she waited for a translator to filter meaning through another mouth, another intention, another small hesitation. She hated those pauses. They made her feel like a borrowed person standing in a borrowed life. Tae-sung spoke to others, and she watched their faces change while she remained on the outside, smiling politely like a guest who didn't know when to leave. So she started in quiet moments. A notebook hidden inside an old finance ledger, whispered syllables behind closed doors, late nights pressed against the glow of a phone screen, repeating the same sounds until they stopped feeling like noise. She wrote down everything. Greetings, insults, the strange respectful tones that wrapped around hierarchy like invisible rules. She practiced words under her breath, careful to keep her voice low so no one would hear ambition forming on her tongue. The house helped her learn in ways it never intended. Voices filled the corridors daily. Men arriving early, voices firm, laughter that never reached their eyes. Women who served tea, offering polite words with small bows. Vera listened. At first, it was like standing in rain, everything washing over her without shape. But then patterns appeared, a phrase that came up whenever Tae-sung grew quiet. a title repeated with care, names spoken sharper than knives. That was when she began to understand that this place was not just a house. It was a structure held together by loyalty, fear, and old grudges pretending to sleep. She learned fast because she had to. Curiosity turned into survival. One afternoon, she stayed longer by the staircase than she should have, pretending to admire a painting while two men argued down the hall. They didn't whisper. Confident men rarely do. She understood maybe half of what they said, but half was enough. There was talk of shipments, of men defecting, of that brother causing trouble again. Do-hyun. The name scratched itself into her thoughts and refused to leave. From then on, every mention of him sharpened her focus. Tae-sung spoke of him rarely, and when he did, the air got heavier. Not hatred, exactly. Something colder. A rivalry rooted in childhood, maybe, or in the kind of pride that doesn't allow forgiveness. The organization felt it too. Whenever Do-hyun's name surfaced, the room shifted, as if everyone silently calculated where to stand when the storm finally hit. Her listening turned into eavesdropping, and eavesdropping turned into strategy. She mapped words against faces. She watched the men closest to Tae-sung, how some leaned toward him like gravity pulled them, while others stood close but with shoulders too stiff, loyalty wrapped in caution. Slowly, like putting together a puzzle with missing edges, she began to understand who trusted whom, who resented being outranked, who bowed with sincerity and who bowed with bitterness. One evening during dinner, Tae-sung joked with his crew about something she only half understood. The translator beside her waited for the right rhythm to pass before turning the joke into English. Vera didn't wait. She had already caught the meaning. For once, she laughed on time. Tae-sung looked at her. It wasn't suspicion, more like a flicker of surprise, followed by something unreadable. He didn't say anything, but she caught the question in his eyes. How much did she understand? She pretended she didn't see it. Night after night, she practiced. She whispered words while brushing her teeth. Read the alphabet until it no longer looked like symbols, but like doors. Sometimes frustration clawed up her throat, especially when she knew a sentence but couldn't hold it still in her mind long enough to follow it completely. She thought of quitting many times. It would have been easier to let translators decide what truth she got. But she remembered the first time she heard people laugh while she stood silent, unsure if they were laughing with her, at her, or about something that could change her life. She refused to go back to that blindness. Days grew sharper. Conversations grew clearer. She no longer heard meaningless sound. She heard layers. Hidden insults wrapped in politeness. Agreements that sounded friendly but tasted like threats. A new confidence stirred inside her, quiet but growing. Then came the night that confirmed everything. She was walking past the study when she heard Tae-sung's voice rise, steady but tense. Another voice replied, older, rough around the edges. They didn't know she was nearby. The door wasn't fully closed. She leaned ever so slightly toward the gap, her heart hammering in her ribs. No translator, no filter, just voices and truth. They spoke about Do-hyun, about how he had gathered men who didn't like the way Tae-sung ran things, about money that had gone missing, about men who had switched allegiance without saying it aloud. Vera stood there breathing slow, each word like a puzzle piece snapping into place. There was talk of a meeting that hadn't gone well. There was talk of a warning. There was talk that soon the quiet between them would end. She didn't understand every piece, but she understood enough to know the ground beneath this house was shifting. Later, alone in her room, she stared at the ceiling. The language she once feared now pulsed in her thoughts, full of danger and meaning. Learning Korean had begun as an act of stubborn pride. Now it was something else entirely. It was a key, It let her hear tremors before they became earthquakes. It let her see the truth behind polite smiles. But knowledge brings responsibility, even when no one asked for it. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the growing tension between Tae-sung and Do-hyun, or the fact that she no longer stood outside it. She was not just a quiet observer anymore. She was inside the storm now, aware, alert, and tied to a man whose world was about to catch fire. And she understood enough Korean now to know that once it did, there would be no stepping back to safety. Min Seo spoke the way a thundercloud thinks, quiet, heavy, as if the sky might split without warning. She didn't look up from the teacup in her hands when she said it. "They're saying he's going to use the gala." The words carried their own chill. Vera felt it first in her shoulders, then in her breathing, like the air had changed weight. The city outside the window kept moving with its usual noise and traffic, unaware that someone out there had decided to turn an elegant night into bait. Min Seo finally lifted her eyes, and there was no drama there, no exaggeration, just worry sharpened into something steady. "It's about you, and Do-hyun's name keeps coming up with it." Vera wanted to brush it off. Part of her had learned to live with whispers. Rumors came and went like weather. But ever since Do-hyun had started circling her life like a shadow that refused to stay in its place, she had learned the difference between noise and the kind of talk that meant something bad had already begun. "Rumors aren't proof," Vera replied, though the words already tasted like denial. Min Seo didn't argue. She knew that Vera was smart enough to hear her own uncertainty. The gala was not optional. It never was. Every year, sponsors, donors, politicians, and carefully dressed people with carefully rehearsed smiles gathered beneath chandeliers to talk about saving lives while drinking champagne. Vera had spent days preparing her speech on violence prevention, writing it, rewriting it, trying to give it real weight instead of polite applause. She believed in every word. That might be what made it dangerous. On the evening of the event, the hotel ballroom glowed in warm gold. Music floated lazily above conversations. Cameras flashed. Staff members moved in silent choreography. Everything was beautifully staged, too beautiful for Terror to fit comfortably inside, which only meant Terror would choose the quietest corner to sit in. Vera felt the eyes before she could see faces. Not everyone staring. Just enough. A pattern her instincts picked up even without full understanding. A few men spaced across the room, blending in well enough to be forgettable if one wasn't paying attention. She forced herself to keep breathing like nothing felt wrong. She greeted people. She smiled on cue. She thanked donors and shook hands that lasted a second longer than she wanted. She reminded herself, you cannot act afraid. Fear turns into alarm. Alarm turns into chaos. Chaos is where Do-hyun thrives. Min Seo stayed close without hovering. At one point, she leaned slightly near Vera's ear, eyes still fixed straight ahead like actors in a play. Left balcony, 2 near the entrance, 1 by catering. They aren't here to eat. Vera didn't look. She simply nodded once. The night had already chosen its direction. Someone tapped a glass. Lights softened, focusing toward the stage. Vera's name was announced with polished ceremony, as though this moment was meant to be a milestone, a proud step into something better. She walked toward the podium to polite applause that felt strangely muted to her ears, like it was happening underwater. Her notes waited on the lectern, but she barely glanced at them. She could feel the presence of those men now, the shape of the danger built into the room like invisible architecture. Her fingertips rested on the edge of the podium to ground herself. She began to speak. Her voice came out steady, calm, warm. She spoke about cycles of harm, about how violence doesn't fall out of the sky but grows out of silence and fear, and how people are always the solution, not just policies or speeches like this one. She talked about children who deserved safer streets, families who deserved to stop waiting for terrible news, and communities that could refuse to let fear be normal. The crowd watched. Some nodded. Some looked thoughtful. Somewhere in the room, someone who worked for Do Hyun checked his watch. Vera felt something change in the atmosphere. A subtle tension pulled the space tighter. The men Min Seo had spotted were no longer pretending as convincingly. They shifted, adjusted jackets, eyes sharpened as if someone had signaled internally that the page was about to turn. Min Seo moved her position slightly, like a chess piece sliding into a better square. Security on the venue floor began to notice what Vera and Min Seo already knew. You can always tell when normal breaks. It's like a sound you can't hear but your body does. Vera kept talking. She didn't allow her gaze to dart. She didn't break rhythm. Every word had to keep the room anchored. Panic was the easiest weapon in the world, and she refused to hand it over. The doors at the far end opened more forcefully than they should have. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. People felt it. Heads turned. Conversations that weren't supposed to exist during a speech began in whisper form. A ripple moved through the crowd. One of Do Hyun's men touched the side of his ear. Another adjusted his stance, weight leaning forward as if waiting for gravity to give permission. Vera controlled her breathing and did the strangest, bravest thing she could in that moment. She raised her voice, not with fear, but with conviction so clear that it shook the surface of the night. Violence only wins when people in rooms like this decide their comfort matters more than their courage. It wasn't just a line anymore. It was a warning. It was a challenge, possibly a shield. Eyes snapped toward her, toward the men, toward the tension now visible. Security finally surged discreetly into motion. The calm elegance of the gala stretched, cracked, and tried desperately not to shatter in front of donors with perfect hair. Do Hyun's plan wasn't chaos for chaos' sake. It had rhythm, meaning, message. He wanted control. He wanted fear with purpose. But intentions sometimes stumble when the target refuses to act like a victim. Vera finished her final sentence with a stillness that didn't wobble. Applause came late. Then it came harder than expected, like the room wanted to declare itself alive. People had no idea how close they stood to something sharp, yet they clapped as if the speech was the most powerful thing in the building. The men did not strike. Not tonight. They watched her instead. They memorized her calm. They measured it. And then, with the same quiet efficiency with which they had come, some of them slipped away into the hallways and the city beyond. Plans were not abandoned. They were delayed. Min Seo reached Vera just as she stepped down from the stage. Their eyes met briefly. No smiles. Just a shared understanding. A game had been played without anyone announcing the rules out loud. Somewhere far away, Do Hyun would hear how the night ended, and he would not like it. The sound doesn't arrive like thunder. It slips in first as confusion. The scrape of a chair, a single shout, the kind noise people mistake for clumsiness before their minds catch up to danger. Then, the marble floor vibrates beneath Vera's shoes, and the echo of fast footsteps spreads like a crack in glass. People turn. Someone laughs nervously. Someone swears. Then the first shot tears the air apart, and every fragile assumption shatters. Vera doesn't freeze. Fear runs through her body, fast and electric, but it doesn't pin her in place. It sharpens her. Her eyes sweep the grand hall once, picking details the way she always has, like she's cataloging the world before it vanishes. The pillars, the central staircase, the ornamental balustrade, the service door half hidden by an antique statue. She knows what's behind it. She knows every odd hallway of this place, every forgotten maintenance corridor, every passage she discovered while wandering alone, thinking she was only trying to escape boredom. Turns out she'd been rehearsing for this. Another shot, louder now. Screams break open everywhere. People drop. Some run in the worst possible direction, toward wide spaces where sound travels and bullets do too. Security reacts a fraction too slow, because the brain always wants to believe this can't really be happening. The gunmen move like people who came in with a plan. Vera's hand is already on Taesung's arm. He was beside her a second ago, his face calm in that careful way of his, the kind that hides thinking, not feelings. Now his jaw has gone rigid, his body listening to danger like it's speaking directly to him. "Don't," he says, as if he knows she's about to do something that breaks the rules of panic. She leans closer. Her voice stays low, steady, like she's reminding him of something they casually discussed instead of whispering into a storm. "Da follow wa," she says in Korean first. "Follow me." The words come out instinctively, shaped by urgency. Then more clearly, firmer. "Jigum. Areseo?" Now. Understand? For a moment he just looks at her, eyes wide, not because of fear alone, but because he doesn't expect her to be the one like this, so focused, already calculating. She tugs his sleeve once, and whatever hesitation he has, snaps. He follows. They move against the tide of panic, slipping between bodies trying to escape toward the obvious exits. The obvious places are always the most dangerous places. That thought runs through her with the certainty of something she has read, tested, and tucked away for later. A table goes over behind them. Someone falls. Someone wails a name. A security guard shouts something. Another shot answers like punctuation. Vera keeps them close to the wall. Her heart is racing hard enough to hurt, but the fear doesn't control her hands. The statue looms ahead, tall and silent, like it has been watching people pretend to be safe for too many years. Beside it is the narrow wooden door no one uses unless they work here or explore when no one is watching. She slips through it. Taesung is right behind her. The door clicks shut. Sound changes instantly, like stepping underwater. The marble hall becomes a muffled storm on the other side. He grabs her wrist. Not rough, not stopping her, just needing to anchor to something real. "Vera," he whispers, breath tight. "How did you—" She shakes her head. No time. She tilts her chin forward. Move. The service corridor smells like metal and cleaning chemicals. It's narrow, painted in dull colors, built for people who do unseen work. Lights hum overhead. She remembers each turn because she walked these halls so many times when nobody knew or cared where she went. Back then, she thought she was escaping loneliness. Now it feels like those lonely walks have chosen to repay her. They move fast, but controlled, shoes whispering against old tile. Taesung keeps glancing back, listening for footsteps that don't belong to them. The gunfire doesn't fade. It only grows farther away in layers, echo hitting echo. Somewhere above, someone shouts orders. The building feels alive with fear. She speaks again, softer, Korean threading through the tension. They'll expect everyone to run out the front or hide in open rooms. This place, she gestures ahead. They won't know. You knew all this? His voice is hushed wonder wrapped around disbelief. You mapped it? Not on purpose. The honesty comes with a strange calm. I just walk. There's a strange kind of poetry in that, like every restless evening when she trailed through unfamiliar doors now stands behind her like a quiet army. Sometimes the mind prepares itself without telling you. A corner, a junction. She slows, lifts a hand, listens. Close silence is worse than chaos. It means danger could be anywhere. Then footsteps. Not theirs. heavy. They flatten against the wall. A guard rushes past at a sprint, expression locked in grim urgency. Not searching corridors like this. Good. That confirms something. They aren't systematically sweeping back rooms. Not yet. Tae-sung looks at her again. And this time the shock in his eyes is mixed with something steadier. Respect? Yes. But also this dawning recognition that the girl beside him is not the fragile presence people often assume she is. There's steel there. She didn't grow it now. It was always there. Crisis just burns away anything hiding it. Jalhago iseo. He murmurs in Korean, barely a breath. You're doing well. She doesn't answer. Compliments feel like luxuries from another planet. Instead, she nudges him forward again. They weave deeper into the service network. Stairs lead downward toward storage, upward toward maintenance floors and hidden balconies that overlook the main hall from angles visitors never see. The building becomes a puzzle she already knows the solution to. Every choice has weight. Every turn is a negotiation with risk. They pause only when they reach a quiet landing. The noise outside is distant enough now to sound unreal, like part of a film. Vera presses her back to the wall and finally lets herself breathe more deeply. Tae-sung watches her, chest rising and falling, still keyed up but calmer than he would have been if he'd been alone. That realization shows on his face. He's used to leading. He isn't used to relying on someone else's instincts. You didn't panic, he says quietly, switching back to Korean as if English feels too clumsy for what he wants to say. You planned, under fire. She swallows. Her hands are trembling now that movement has paused, but her voice doesn't betray it. It didn't feel like planning. It just felt like knowing where to stand. Outside, more shots. Closer again now, like the situation keeps shifting, fluid and dangerous. This isn't over. Not for them. Not for anyone trapped inside. Tae-sung straightens and nods once, the decision settling in him. We use what you know. We stay ahead of them. His eyes soften for half a second. Stay with me. She almost laughs at that, a thin, breathless sound. I've been leading you this whole time. He smiles despite everything. It's quick and tired and strangely tender in a place that has no space for tenderness. Then don't stop. So they move again, two shadows threaded through the building's unseen veins, guided by memory, instinct, and a fragile thread of trust neither of them planned for, but both of them are already depending on. The world outside the service corridor is breaking, but inside, Vera is steady, and Tae-sung follows not because he has to, but because he has seen what she becomes when the marble starts to bleed and everything pretends to fall apart. The metal door sealed with a hiss that felt like the world shrinking. Concrete walls, dim lights, and the low hum of filtered air wrapped around them like a cage that had already decided who owned it. Outside, distant thuds and muffled shouts reminded Vera that danger still lived beyond these walls, but inside the panic room there was only silence, and him. Tae-sung stood a step away, too composed, like someone watching a storm through reinforced glass rather than standing in the middle of it. He didn't look at her at first. He never looked where the emotion was. He went to control panels, to screens, to numbers and tactical maps, as if facts were safer than feelings. She watched him the same way a cornered animal memorizes everything. The calm in his shoulders, the faint crease in his brow he probably didn't know appeared whenever he worried, the tiny pause in his breath when the gunfire outside quieted. He behaved like a man protecting a city. She was only one person. Yet he had dragged her down here himself, shielding her body like it was the most irreplaceable piece of evidence in his life. When he finally turned toward her, they looked like two strangers forced into a room by fate or by the cruel joke of a wedding vow. For a breath, neither spoke. The humming of the panic room made their silence sound louder, she broke first. Her voice didn't tremble. Korean rolled out of her mouth clear and sharp, the way truth slices through air when it has waited too long. 결혼 signal. 네가 말한 거 들었어. I heard what you said on our wedding day. He blinked, the smallest crack in his carefully built wall. She kept going, because if she stopped now, she would drown in everything she'd swallowed for months. 나를 원한 적 없다고 했지. 이건 합의야, 거래야, 책임이지, 사랑은 아니라고. You said you never wanted me. This is an arrangement, a deal, a responsibility, not love. The words hung there like smoke that refused to clear. She remembered that day so vividly. The smiles, the applause, the rings slipping onto fingers while secrets beat inside his chest. She had stood inches away from him, close enough to feel the warmth of his hand, and still somehow further from him than anyone in the room. It had hurt in a way she couldn't name then. Now, trapped with nowhere to look except at him, the pain demanded its explanation. Her jaw tightened. 그럼 왜 항상 나를 지켜보는 거야? Then why do you watch me every second? He looked at her fully now. No more screens, no maps, only her. Korean, he said quietly, also in their shared language, as if choosing it meant he was choosing honesty too. You weren't supposed to hear that. That's your defense? She laughed softly, bitter and tired. I wasn't supposed to hear that. Not that it wasn't true, just that I shouldn't have heard it. He exhaled and his gaze dropped, like he wanted to place the truth somewhere on the floor because it was too heavy to hold eye to eye. Things were complicated, he said. They always are with you, she replied. Complicated means you get to hide behind strategy and I'm expected to understand. Silence. The room buzzed. Somewhere above them, metal groaned. Men shouted orders, lives moved. In here, time waited. He finally spoke again. I said those words because that marriage wasn't supposed to be personal. It was supposed to protect you. It was supposed to stabilize alliances. You were safer if you were something official, something impossible to touch without declaration of war. His voice stayed controlled, but the edges were fraying. If I said I wanted you, that I cared, you would become a weapon for others to use against me. So the solution was what? Pretend I was disposable? She shook her head. You didn't just make me a shield. You turned me into a question I could never answer. Every time you looked at me, I wondered whether I was a burden you tolerated or a person you couldn't admit mattered. He swallowed, and for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't look like someone who could command armies with a sentence. He looked almost human. You think I watch you because I don't want you? His voice lowered, heavier, less controlled. I watch you because if something happens to you, I won't survive it and I hate that. I watch you because every decision I make has blood attached to it, and you are the one part of my life I don't allow to bleed. I watch you because the day you became part of my life, every enemy I had got a new target. So yes, I never wanted to put you in this life, but you are here, and I will not lose you. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. Not here, not yet. That's not affection, Taesung. That's possession. That's control dressed up as protection. Maybe it started as control, he admitted. I know how to secure cities, corporations, syndicates. I don't know how to secure something soft without crushing it by accident. But don't you dare think you mean nothing. Don't you dare think I don't care. I care so much I turned it into strategy because that is the only language I know how to survive with. He stepped closer, stopping halfway like there was an invisible line between them that neither of them trusted. His voice softened, but it didn't lose its strength. When I said I didn't want you, I meant I didn't want to hurt you with my world. I didn't want you dragged into shadows I can't escape. I didn't want you trapped beside me right now, listening to gunfire and danger as if it's just part of married life. He gestured around the panic room. Yet here you are, because I pulled you into it. She stood still, letting his words land, letting the truth sink in without rushing to forgive or condemn. Feelings weren't switches, they were storms. So, what am I to you? She asked quietly. Am I your duty, your shield, your weakness? He didn't answer immediately. That alone told her this mattered to him more than strategy. He didn't want to say the wrong thing. He didn't want to lie. The pause wasn't manipulation, it was fear. You're the one thing I don't want to turn into a calculation, he said at last. But you ask for honesty, so here it is. I didn't want to marry you, not like this, but I wanted you safe. And somewhere between those two truths, I started caring too much. Watching you wasn't control. It was relief. Proof you were still breathing. She exhaled slowly. Somewhere far above them, the last echo of violence faded, like the world was deciding, for now, to be quiet again. The safe room stayed sealed. They were still trapped. But something else shifted, something less visible than steel doors. Then stop hiding behind protection, she whispered. If you're going to hold my life this tightly, at least admit you're holding it. He nodded once, not in command this time, but in surrender. Not to her, to honesty. Outside, a knock sounded against the door, one of his men signaling all clear. Inside, neither of them moved yet. The battle outside had ended. Inside, something important had finally begun. He stood there as if the room itself were weighing on his shoulders, as if the air had grown thick enough to choke on. For a long while he said nothing, and she wondered if he would fall back into that familiar silence, that distance he wore so well it almost seemed like a second skin. Then his gaze dropped, not in shame exactly, but in surrender. Something in him finally stopped fighting. I've been a coward, he said quietly, and the word didn't explode between them the way confessions usually do. It just settled there, heavy and tired, like it had been waiting for years to be spoken. Not the kind of coward who runs from danger. I've walked into things most people wouldn't survive. But you were different. She didn't move. She didn't soften. She'd been burned too many times by words dressed as honesty. He seemed to understand that because he didn't reach for her, and he didn't search her face for mercy. He simply kept going, as if he owed the truth not just to her, but to himself. When I first saw your picture, he said, and his voice trembled like a fault line. I felt something hit me so hard I hated it. I hated you for it. 20 years I've lived like ice, by choice, by discipline. Feelings complicate things. They make you hesitate. They make you care about outcomes you can't control. I carved all of that out of myself because it kept me alive. It kept everything simple. He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Just exhaustion and a strange tenderness he had been fighting like a war. But then there you were, and I couldn't be simple anymore. Her fingers curled at her sides. She'd imagined many versions of his truth. None of them sounded like this. Behind all the storms he created, behind the calculated coldness, there had been fear. Not of losing power, not of being challenged, but of feeling human again. You scared me, he admitted. Not because you were fragile. Don't ever think that. You terrified me because you were strong enough to matter, because you could reach the parts of me I worked so hard to bury. Every time I pushed you away, I wasn't trying to punish you. I was trying to protect myself from becoming someone vulnerable again. Someone who could be hurt. Someone who could lose. Her heart ached, not in pity, but in recognition. She understood fear dressed as anger. She understood walls built so carefully they feel like home. So I pretended, he continued. I pretended control was the only language I knew. I pretended possession was easier than partnership. If I kept you at a distance, I could still have you near without risking anything real. That was the lie I built everything on. He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and it was like watching a fortress open its gates for the first time. No armor, no threats. Just a man terrified by the possibility of connection and weary of running from it. I don't want to own you, he said. I don't want you trapped with me out of obligation or fear or confusion. I don't want someone who stands behind me or beneath me. I want someone who stands next to me. I want a partner. Someone who can call me out when I'm wrong. Someone who doesn't disappear when things get hard. Someone I have to keep choosing. She let the silence breathe between them because this moment deserved air. She studied him, the cracks, the honesty, the unfamiliar humility, and realized something had shifted. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for permission to keep hurting her in gentler ways. He was finally choosing to be accountable. You hurt me, she said softly. Not because you were cruel for pleasure, but because you refused to let me meet the real you. You kept me wrestling with shadows. He nodded, as if he'd already sentenced himself for that crime. And if we do this, she continued, steady now, we do it differently. I'm not an object you guard. I'm not a possession you store on a shelf when I become inconvenient. I don't want to be something you control. I want to be someone you trust. His throat tightened. Then trust has to go both ways. I'm going to fail sometimes. Old habits don't vanish because I finally decided to talk. I'm asking you to push me when I retreat, not chase me, not beg me. Just hold your ground and remind me we chose partnership, not dominance. It sounded maddening and hopeful at the same time. Real things usually are. She took a slow breath, not rushing the moment, not letting emotion sweep her into easy forgiveness. This wasn't about dramatic reunions or sudden perfection. This was about two people deciding they would stop pretending strength meant silence. So, we start new, she said. Not from fantasy, from truth. No more pretending you're stone. No more pretending I'm unbreakable. We move forward with honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. Something softened in his face, a quiet relief mixed with humility. He stepped closer, but not imposing, not claiming. Just close enough to feel like the beginning of something real rather than the return to something broken. I can live with that, he whispered. I want to live with that. There was no dramatic embrace, no cinematic music swelling in invisible speakers, just two people finally standing in the same emotional space, aware of how fragile and powerful that was. His coldness wasn't strength anymore. Her resilience wasn't a shield anymore. This wasn't conquest. It wasn't surrender. It was agreement, not ownership, partnership. The storm began without thunder. It moved quietly through meetings held behind thick doors and messages passed by hands that never trembled. Tae-sung didn't raise his voice, didn't roar like a man hungry for revenge. He planned the way a chess player studies a board he already knows he will win, and for 8 long days, that certainty wrapped itself around everyone who stood beside him. Vera stood there too, not as a shadow clinging to his side, but as someone with her own oxygen, her own gravity, her own usefulness. That surprised many of them. It surprised her a little as well. They called it a counteroffensive, as if it were some military campaign in a forgotten war. But in truth, it was more personal than that. Do-hyun had torn lines through loyalty and trust. He had gambled on fear. Tae-sung answered not with anger, but with discipline. It was unsettling how steady he was. When men expected rage, they got patience. When they waited for fire, they were handed ice. Vera watched him and thought about how people like Do-hyun never believed someone like Tae-sung could love anything enough to fight with clarity. They misunderstood him the same way they misunderstood storms. It wasn't the lightning that ruined cities. It was the pressure they never saw building. Her role slipped into place like it had always been there. While Tae-sung's lieutenants spoke in hardened language, counting resources and anticipating movement, Vera translated the human part of the conflict. She broke down Do-hyun's pride, explained how his fear disguised itself as aggression, how betrayal was never impulsive, always layered with self-justification and silent rehearsals. "He won't run," she said once, leaning over the table, charts and files spread open beneath harsh light. "He thinks retreat would rewrite the narrative of who he is. He'd rather lose everything while pretending he's still in control than accept survival with humility. That's the weak point. Pride always is." At first, the men in the room exchanged uncertain glances, as if her words were something fragile they weren't trained to handle. Then Tae-sung nodded. That was all it took. Once he accepted her presence as necessary, everyone else followed. She worked quietly, never dramatic, offering small insights that shifted decisions by inches. Inches are what wins in situations like that. Something in Tae-sung softened when he looked at her across those tables, not in the romantic way of stories people write when they want to exaggerate emotion, but like a man who finally realized he didn't have to be the only steady one in the room. The days blurred, stretched, and folded into each other. Pressure mounted. No one slept properly. Power rearranged itself like tectonic plates shifting beneath a city. The end didn't come with explosions. It arrived with a final decision and a simple truth. Do-hyun was out of moves. When he fell, it wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic. It was simply the quiet conclusion of a man who had convinced himself he could outrun consequences and discovered he could not. Tae-sung didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He carried the weight the way people like him always do, like responsibility had become part of his bloodstream. The 8 days finished, and the world did not snap back to normal. Something else formed instead, steadier, stronger, scarred but still standing. Time moved, as it always does, stubborn and indifferent. 2 years later, a different kind of quiet filled their lives. Morning light slipped through curtains in a home that felt earned rather than inherited. The organization listened when Vera spoke now, not because she belonged to Tae-sung, but because she had proven she understood the difficult parts of people. Fluent Korean rolled naturally from her tongue, smooth and confident, the language no longer foreign but woven into her daily thinking. She didn't sit behind him anymore during meetings. She sat beside him. On a warm afternoon, she held their son in her arms, a small, breathing piece of tomorrow. He was soft and curious, his fingers constantly reaching, as if even from infancy he refused to stay still. Tae-sung watched them with the same steady expression he wore facing wars and decisions, yet there was gentleness in it, quiet pride he never spoke aloud. He approached fatherhood like he approached everything meaningful, without show, without noise, but with unwavering commitment. Sometimes Vera remembered who she had been before all of this, the woman cautious with her feelings, living inside her thoughts more than her life, afraid of belonging anywhere too deeply. Life had pulled her into darkness, but instead of being swallowed by it, she found someone else walking through the same shadows with his own wounds and stubborn heart. They never pretended their story was pretty. It wasn't. It was complicated and messy and filled with choices that could not be washed clean. Yet somewhere inside that chaos, something real formed. People whispered about her when she passed, not as Tae-sung's foreign wife, not as a decoration meant to soften his image. They spoke of her as someone who could read storms before they broke, someone who spoke with calm certainty, someone who had earned a seat at the table. Respect arrived not like applause, but like gravity, steady, constant, unarguable. She carried it with quiet dignity. Their relationship was not a fairy tale written to make hearts flutter. It was stronger than that. It was built from long conversations spoken in low voices when the world outside felt threatening. It grew in shared silence, in trust earned day after day, in the strange comfort they found in knowing the other person would stay, even when things were not easy. Love appeared not as fireworks, but as warmth that refused to fade. Holding her child, Vera felt a stillness inside herself she had never known. Tae-sung came to stand behind her, not claiming her, not towering over her, simply existing beside her as someone equal, someone whose strength didn't overshadow hers, but walked alongside it. They had not built a life out of obligation or tradition. They built it because, somehow, two damaged people discovered they functioned better together than apart. What they shared was not born in light. It was shaped in darkness, in danger, in moments where trust could have shattered but didn't. And somehow, from all of that, they built a family, steady, unexpected, real. Thank you for sticking around with me. My wonderful story family. Before you go, I'd love to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me more than you can imagine and keeps these videos coming. The link is right below the video. Drop your location below. I want to know where my story family is watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it.